From Community Public Radio, this is the CPR News. From New York, I'm Don DeBar. Today we're going to Moscow to speak with analyst Mark Sloboda and continue the discussion that we've been having about the situation that's evolving in China with the U.S. and Taiwan. Mark, welcome.
Don, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be with you on CPR.
Thank you very much. The same. That we're glad to have you. So let's see. We were talking about basically how the U.S. seemed to be provoking or whatever in a dance with Taiwan, sort of daring China, the People's Republic of China, to move against Taiwan so the United States can move against China. And I guess 2 weeks have passed since the last time we discussed this. Maybe you could update us and we can talk around the four corners of that. Because I'm curious if we might be actually heading into a war, either stumbling into it or what.
Okay, so, according to the U.S. Headlines, if you're reading the headlines and the TV news, China is threateningly flying its warplanes over Taiwan. Okay, well, actually, if you read a little further, they're not actually flying them over Taiwan. They're just flying them through its airspace. And then, read a little further. China actually isn't flying its airplanes through Taiwanese airspace. It's actually an international airspace, off the coast of Taiwan, somewhat to the south, but within Taiwan's air defense identification zone. You're like, well, that sounds bad. And you're like, well, an air defense identification zone is actually self-declared. It's a tradition that the U.S. started. It's got no basis in any international law, no body that oversees it. And Taiwan's air defense identification zone, and I ask you, pull up a map to show this. Because while China's air defense identification zone hugs its coast, Taiwan's absurdly expansive air defense identification zone covers a whole big chunk of mainland China.
I see this.
Many times the size of Taiwan itself, right? So that if China flies a plane from one base in China on its own territory to another military base in China, they could technically be flagged for violating Taiwan's air defense identification zone. And then if you read even maybe a little bit further, you'll find that this Taiwanese air defense identification zone was originally drawn by the U.S. Air Force for Taiwan back in the 1950s.
So let's say let's say China, for argument's sake, decided to set up an air defense identification zone, say, in Long Island Sound. Would that mean that if I go to JFK or to one of the New York City airports, we can't fly over Long Island Sound anymore without violating China's territorial integrity?
Well, of course, it doesn't actually have anything to do with territorial integrity,
right,
or anything like that. It is a request to other countries' militaries to declare themselves within that zone, and there's absolutely nothing to enforce it. And while the United States proudly trumpets when other countries break these things, it, of course, does not abide by them when it itself is parading its military forces up and down off China's coast. In fact, China has declared recently a equivalent naval identification zone off the coast of China, right? Including the Taiwan Straits, because the U.S. is there so often, and the U.S. of course has refused to comply by it, and to let China officially know when they are there. Now, in the first 8 months of Joe Biden's presidency, Joe Biden has sent U.S. naval warships into the Taiwan Straits, through the Taiwan Straits, 8 times on so-called euphemistically freedom of navigation exercises. Now, just so
people understand the geography, Taiwan, we're talking about like basically islands off of the Chinese coast, and the Taiwan Straits being the sea between China and Taiwan, basically, right?
Yeah.
So, okay.
And just so you're clear on the terminology here, when China flies its own planes off of its own coast in international airspace, but violating the very edge of Taiwan's air defense identification zone, it is provocative, coercive, militarily coercive behavior that is destabilizing the region.
Right.
But when the U.S. and its allies send their navies regularly up and down, showing the size of their reproductive organs off China's coast on the other side of the world, that is good freedom of navigation exercise. That is not coercive military threat. That is not destabilizing to the region. That is good. Just so you understand the difference there. China
it's like
off its own coast, bad. U.S. off China's coast, good. Right.
It's exactly like there are these cases in the International Court of Justice having to do with certain, littoral lands, adjacent water lands. For example, competing claims between the Philippines and China in Asia, and a decision from the court there, and between Nicaragua and Colombia and I forget which other neighbor, Costa Rica, I believe, in Central America. The International Court of Justice sides with Nicaragua there, and the other two completely ignore it, and the United States supports them in ignoring it and calls the decision by the ICJ absurd and also doesn't acknowledge its jurisdiction. On the other hand, in the Philippines, until Duterte came into power and decided not to prosecute the case, the Philippines won their claim in the ICJ against China, and the United States was ready, willing, and able almost to go to war to make sure that claim was respected, talking about how the ICJ was the sort of a standard of international law, etc. It's the same principle here.
Yeah. And on top of that, we have the situation where, according to no less a source than the Wall Street Journal, it appears that the U.S. Has basically de facto thrown away its decades-long one China policy, and has secretly had U.S. military in Taiwan for at least a year now.
Wow.
Marines, special forces, some of them at least supposedly engaged in training exercises there. But of course, the U.S. still officially has a one China policy where they do not recognize the government of the so-called Republic of China, the nationalist established Taiwan. They do recognize the government in Beijing, and they recognize that Taiwan is part of China. And a part of that understanding was the U.S. doesn't put military forces in Taiwan. That of course, is out the door. Right. We also have Joe Biden approving his first arms sale to Taiwan, a $750 million deal. That comes on the back of U.S. In 2020, the U.S. sold last year. The U.S. sold $5.1 billion worth of arms to Taiwan. Now, of course, China sees this as dangerous separatism. They see this as the U.S. throwing away, rightly, the U.S. throwing away the one-child policy in all but name, or one China policy in all but name, right. And promoting separatism of a part of their country, an island off their coast, which they consider, historically and for lots of other reasons are part of theirs. And China just today reiterated the reason that we are doing, we are flying our warplanes in international airspace off of our coast near Taiwan, right, is because you are putting troops in Taiwan. You are parading your navy off of our coast every month on a routine basis.
Right.
You are challenging us on this everything here. Your spy planes are buzzing our coast, nearly every day. We're going to show our military strength, to respond, which,
Right.
from at least my point of view, makes total sense in this regard.
Right.
And we have also in the Washington Post a piece by Democratic Congressman and U.S. Navy veteran, Vice Chair of the Armed Forces House Armed Services Committee, Elaine Luria, writing an op-ed, Congress must untie Biden's hands on Taiwan, which she means that she wants to abrogate Congress's authorization to be in charge of declaring war once again, right up front, and give Biden the authority to go to war with China over Taiwan now, just in case he ever needs it.
Right.
Which, of course, is probably meant as more of a deterrent message to China than anything else, saying, hey, we're ready to go to war. Which some people, Americans, might be a little shocked by. But the anti-China propaganda wave in the U.S. has reached such a level where we now see that a majority of Americans, some 60%, now view China as the U.S.'s number one enemy.
Right.
I'm not exactly sure why, what China has ever done to actually determine that.
I could tell you. I could
offering to build 5G networks.
Yeah, right. I could tell you what it is in 10 seconds. It's essentially a portion of them because Trump was painting China as the enemy as he prepared to do negotiations over business deals. And then on the other hand, because the Democrats call them the enemy, and so the Democratic people that are anti-Trump basically agree with that. So you have more or less
bipartisan.
You have all of the Democrats and half of the Republicans on those 2 points without even knowing how to spell China. That's where they've fallen. That's what's reflecting in those polls, I'm sure.
So we have polls out now showing that for the first time, the majority of Americans are willing to go to war with China over Taiwan, 52%. And that's the first time that has happened. So the war drums are beating on multiple fronts. And everyone, you have to ask yourself, why? And the question, the rise of this is, one is the rise, primarily the rise of the Chinese economy. During the 90s, the U.S. was all mouthing win-win. We trade, you trade, everyone wins, right? Globalization, win-win, win-win, win-win. Now, if China wins, the U.S. loses. Those are headlines of major U.S. media, right? Right. That because now China is threatening and by some standards has overrun, the U.S. At the top of, economic comparisons on some scales, at least. Now suddenly that's a threat because, of course, with economic strength follows military strength. Right. If your country has economic success and your government has more money, then you spend more on the military, and that is viewed as a threat by the U.S. And U.S. geopolitical thinkers, military brass, which are often the same thing, they are regularly talking about an inevitable naval conflict with China, not off the coast of California, not in Hawaii, not in the middle of the Pacific, but against China, off China's own coast, right? Yeah. In the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea, because they view themselves in a Thucydides trap, and referring to the ancient Greek political philosopher that said with a fading hegemon and a potential rising hegemon, right? He was discussing, Athens at this point, Athens-Sparta conflict. That conflict is inevitable, and this has trapped the U.S. political and military elite in a Thucydides trap, where they view
And they have to do it because they think it's coming.
They have to do it because otherwise we'll be pushed off the king of the hill, and we can't allow that to happen. And right now, if we can't economically outcompete China, then we've still got the military advantage conventionally and strategically with nuclear weapons now. So we'd best use this window of opportunity in the next 5 to 15 years, because if we don't, then we won't have that advantage. And China will have built up its navy enough that we can't beat it off of its own. Us and all of our allies can't beat it off of its coast, of its own coast. And then our control of the seas and global trade will be challenged. And this is, of course, extremely important to China because China is an export economy. It brings natural resources in by much of it by maritime trade, and then it processes it, turns it into consumer things, and then sends it out again around the world. And it needs access to these globalized maritime trade networks to do this. And it sees the U.S., putting long strings of bases and naval forces positioned to control that trade network. And it sees extremely aggressive U.S. military behavior around the world, including seizing Iranian oil vessels under their illegal unilateral sanctions, basically act of piracy. And they're like, hey, what's to stop them from doing that with our trade? And that's how we maintain domestic stability. That's how we provide, for our people. That's how we've lifted so many people out of poverty and, really improved the lives of so many of our people. And if we have that, at a knife's edge from this aggressive hegemonic power, that is, something that from a realist foreign policy viewpoint, that is a really unacceptable threat. And the reality is, despite the all of this euphemism about the U.S. doing freedom of navigation exercises off China's coast, it is the U.S. that is the biggest threat to freedom of navigation and free trade around the world, the U.S. and its allies. And we've seen that repeatedly, with Iranian oil tankers going to Syria, with North Korean ships everywhere. The U.S., level sanctions against someone, and in their viewpoint, that entitles them to seize naval traffic, trade, maritime trade anywhere in the world. And if you remember the furor in the media just a couple months ago when it was thought that Iran might be sending a ship into the Atlantic Ocean, into the U.S.'s side of the world. The insane furor in the press about the threat that represented. And actually, it was actually going to Russia, to St. Petersburg for a Naval Day festivities there. But it was absolutely, they might be coming to South America. They might be coming to Venezuela, into our hemisphere. Right. They don't have freedom of navigation. Only we have freedom of navigation.
That's right. It's like the freedom of the press with the, only for people that have printing press, and free Second Amendment only for people that have really big guns and can come take yours. It's, it's just consistency again.
So the U.S. has been doing this military pivot to Asia, to the Pacific, to confront China, since the early Obama administration. It is continuing, but China is also rapidly building their naval capability and experience, and the U.S. is getting increasingly worried that its conventional advantage is fading, and that if there's going to be a confrontation, it better that it happens now. And then you talk about, well, won't that immediately go nuclear? Won't strategic? Well, no. And here's the reason for that. Because the U.S., still bound by the New START treaty with Russia, has some 1,500 nuclear weapons that are deployed and ready to be fired at a moment's notice by the trifecta of intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines, and nuclear bombers. Meanwhile, according to most nuclear experts, China has some between 200 and 300 nuclear weapons, which is actually less than the UK, slightly more than France.
Right.
And they do have intention, quite obviously, of building more of them now when they realize that their strategic deterrent is not big enough to be any type of deterrent to the U.S.
Right.
But they don't right now, and most of those are on old fueling systems that will require, even on what small number of intercontinental ballistic missiles they have at the moment, will require like a 30-minute startup time for most of them. And so basically the number of birds they could get into the air in a potential nuclear conflict with the United States is so small. And the U.S., anti-ballistic missile defense network from THAADs in Japan Alaska to the U.S. coastline is
Korea,
such that,
and also probably in Taiwan too. Right.
Yeah, anything that could possibly get through, of course, would be acceptable losses for wiping out China.
Right.
So even if China was losing a naval conflict off their own coast,
right,
they would not. All right, and there's no. Let's talk. The U.S. is not going to invade China, right? There's 1.8 billion people there. That's not going to happen.
They learned about that in Korea of 1953.
But they will destroy China's navy and bomb the country excessively and try to spur some minority rebellions, and that sort of thing. The usual.
What they do.
This is about destroying their naval capabilities, setting it back by 50 years, causing economic damage and the like.
Right.
And turning then Taiwan into an official U.S. military base off the coast of China rather than a de facto U.S. military base off the coast of China. So, and there's the question of, okay, we know that if the U.S. gets involved in a war against China, the U.K. would get involved. They're already talking just this week about sending more forces, military forces, to Asia. We know Australia would now be involved. We do have this new AUKUS deal where Australia shafted France and instead is going to build, instead of conventional subs, is going to build nuclear subs with the U.S. and the U.K., of course, for use against China, because those nuclear subs will be stealthier, they'll be faster, and they'll be able to sit operationally in the South China Sea for 7 times as long, 77 days operationally, vice 11 days, because they won't need to return for diesel fuel.
Gotcha.
And to that point, the U.S. just ran a nuclear sub aground in the South China Sea because it's a really shallow, dangerous place to be piloting subs. But that's neither here nor there. We know that that Japan, of course, would be involved behind the U.S. and France would, despite being shafted, along with another of other European countries would back, and the rest would back the U.S. politically, at least. It is kind of up in the air whether South Korea would get involved, and they also, like Japan, do have substantial military and naval forces.
Right.
Because, of course, if South Korea became involved, then North Korea would become involved in the conflict on China's side, because they would know that they're next.
Right.
So you have that there. Perhaps India would get involved because we have the Quad, where the U.S. is suddenly switched to using this geopolitical term Indo-Pacific in an attempt to flatter and draw India into this conflict, because the U.S. will gladly fight China to the last piece of Indian cannon fodder.
Right, that's right. Yep.
So then you have a question, will Russia become involved in such a conflict? They're strategic partners with China, right?
Right.
Well, strategic partners is not a formal alliance.
No kidding. And even if there was, it's only paper.
Yeah. So Russia has a foreign policy that is very realist, very pragmatic and cynical to a fault. That's the way the Kremlin thinks. And barring an actual alliance treaty of self-defense, which really doesn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of Russia and China.
For either side, by the way.
Yeah, if there was a military conflict between NATO and Russia in
Europe,
Ukraine,
China would not get... Yeah.
In Europe, would China get involved in that? No, of course not. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
Likewise, Russia's military forces in the east, the Pacific Fleet, are relatively modest, right? They probably would not be a game changer. Right, that's not to say they're non-existent. They have a number of subs out there, and a smaller surface fleet, and they're capable. But would they be a game changer? No, probably not.
Right.
So, no, you probably would not see. Probably, all right. A lot depends on situational. Would not see Russian naval forces coming to China's defense. But here's how Russia would participate in that conflict without participating in that conflict.
Arms sales.
Well, arms sales is one thing. Intelligence, that's another thing.
Advanced weaponry, I'm talking about.
Yeah,
arms
let's be clear. In this conflict, everything will be over in a week.
Oh, yeah, right. Oh, if that.
Right. Yeah. So here's what Russia would do. If the U.S. provoked a military conflict with China off of its own coast, all right, Russia would not, leap to China's direct defense. But let's say that Russia at that point decided that, well, that was a good opportunity to remove that U.S.-backed putsch that seized power in Ukraine back in 2014 that they're not budging on. And while we're at it, let's militarily, do freedom of navigation exercises in the Atlantic and off England's coast and so on. Making the U.S. divide up its forces. Right. Because the U.S. is trying to play global hegemon. Right. They've got to confront the U.S., China and Russia and Iran and a number of other countries militarily at the same time.
So everybody floats everything, right? Iran puts their stuff in the water. Cuba puts, their stuff or whatever.
So you prevent the U.S. from concentrating their military forces. You have to remember the U.S. is some 70-75% of NATO's military forces. You prevent the U.S. From committing everything against China, which is how Russia then participates in that conflict without participating in that conflict.
Now, no guarantee that they're not participating in it, because now suppose NATO pushes back.
Right. So that is the way that scenario would go down. It would be a conventional conflict.
Understood.
It would probably not go nuclear because that would be to the U.S.'s advantage, and it could possibly end the world. And, no one really wants to go there except for a few crazies in the United States, neocons, because they think they can win it. That is the danger. And there are serious people that see, again, the word they use is inevitable, right? I just reading a piece this week where a U.S. Rear Admiral is referring to it's not if, it's when, right? And now is, again, there's a time window of opportunity for peak U.S. military effectiveness now. That's why the U.S. pulled out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, by the way, with Russia. Not because of any alleged Russian violations, but because of China. Because it ties their hands with China. That treaty, of course, because you can't differentiate between a conventional and a nuclear, warhead placed atop of a short and intermediate range missile, bound, launchers. Barred missiles as well, and that buys the U.S. Hands conventionally against China. And the U.S. sees that in that naval conflict off China's own coast, China has a short and intermediate range land-based missile advantage, a missile gap. So they wanted, particularly the U.S. Army, wanted the ability to put short and intermediate range missiles on the land in Guam, in South Japan, and other locations in the West Pacific.
And we got to stop because we're completely out of time. But we'll pick it up here because this is a pretty scary scenario we're walking into, and I want to talk about what China's talking about right now too in response to this. Mark, thank you so much for your time, and we'll speak about this again next week. Okay.
Great. Thanks.
And that's all the news we have for you right now. For Community Public Radio, I'm Don DeBar in New York. Thanks for listening.